My wife, Dorothy, and I have been married for 8 years. Her enchanting beauty and irresistible charm have always been a source of admiration for me. Despite the outward idyll, our life has not been without its difficulties. Lately, our relationship has been going through a rough patch. My wife, it seemed to me, had begun to distance herself, seeking some kind of change, though not immediately. I myself have committed an act that cannot be described as anything other than horrifying, and surprisingly, I have no regrets about it. I am now ready to share that story. Our union began during our college years. We worked our way through college together and soon landed stable jobs. Since then, we've been diligently saving up to buy our first home together. Our only major conflict concerns the issue of children. I would like to become a father, while Dorothy shows no desire to become a mother. Our love began in college, and since then, we have set some boundaries in our relationship. Our intimate life was passionate and consistent until about 5 months ago when things started to change. A shared passion for bird watching initially brought us together during our studies. Our first close contact was in the woods, which still remains a place of special significance to Dorothy. Dorothy, with shoulder-length brown hair and swarthy skin, has a perfect figure. Perhaps her fear of losing that shape is the reason for her reluctance to become a mother. She is characterized by her thick dark hair and her choice not to shave excess body hair, which gives her a special charm. I was madly in love with this woman. Walking down the street holding her hand, in my mind I would say to myself, she's mine. Our favorite pastime, bird watching, fascinated us both, but because of my excessive work commitments, I began to pay less attention to our common interests. Dorothy, on the other hand, continued to pursue it alone, meticulously keeping a diary of observations with an almost obsessive devotion. Because of work, I often stayed late, coming home late and tired, and sometimes falling asleep on the couch. Several days passed without intimacy, and I expected Dorothy to be impatient, but she seemed relieved at the lack of physical contact. This made me reflect on my past behavior, which had improved over time. I decided to change my work schedule to spend more time with Dorothy in an effort to eliminate the tension in our relationship. I even suggested a romantic vacation, but Dorothy expressed concern about possible extended absences from work and stressed the importance of sticking to our financial plan for the down payment on the house. She assured me of her happiness but hinted at potential problems. That night, our attempt to bond was unsuccessful due to her headache. Out of curiosity, I decided to check her diary and found that she regularly left the house for personal investigations. Using my Honda CB motorcycle, which I inherited from my late grandfather and used to commute to work, I began to plan how I could leave work without arousing suspicion. I informed the secretary of my plans to work in the archives and waited to be sent there. Being left alone in the archives, I found it a convenient time to sneak out. The time was approaching and I started packing, because the archive was in the basement of the building, where it was quiet and almost never crowded. I used the emergency fire exit, securing the door with a small wedge so it wouldn't lock and it would be easy for me to get back in without a problem. I parked the bike on the street outside our house, waiting for my wife to return. Once she arrived and changed her clothes, I followed her to the bird watching spot. Due to my frequent visits to the area, I moved easily at a respectful distance, trying not to attract attention. I left the motorcycle among the trees and took another trail, moving carefully to avoid unnecessary noise. My birdwatching experience allowed me to stop occasionally, surveying the surroundings through binoculars. As I climbed to the top of the mountain, I found the trails becoming more prominent and dangerous, leading to ledges ideal for hawk watching. The view from this point of the valley below was breathtaking. Unable to resist the urge, I gazed through my binoculars, surveying the valley for hawks. Suddenly, I heard a chuckle. The dense forest hid the source of the sounds well, making my attempts to detect them difficult. Focusing on the subtle sounds, I eventually spotted them thanks to the yellow lining of my wife's vest. Finding a secluded spot to observe, I arranged myself to remain undetected, equipped with binoculars and a camera attached to a telescope. From this vantage point, I was able to take detailed photographs. My wife's companion turned out to be Jimmy Baxter, a coworker she had met 6 months earlier. I knew him from corporate events where he always seemed like a nice man with the perfect family. Watching him cheat left me confused, wondering why a man with such a life would behave this way. My anger built up, surpassing the initial shock of what I had seen. It was hard for me to accept the fact that I was watching from the bushes as my wife was being intimate with a man I knew well. The urge to intervene was strong, but I forced myself to remain aloof with no clear plan of action in case their brief liaison ended. I watched as Dorothy and Jimmy acted unconcerned. Their behavior did not indicate a love affair. So why were they behaving in such a manner, causing me anxiety and anger? I hurriedly gathered my things and followed Dorothy. She was walking down the path, and I kept a sufficient distance to remain unnoticed. The path led me to the observation deck of Hawk Mountain, a place picturesque but dangerous. That's where Jimmy appeared. Although I was seething with rage inside, I remained calm on the outside. He was apparently on his way home. When he asked what I was doing here, not recognizing me, I made up a story about a red-tailed hawk feeding its chicks in a distant pine tree. Continuing to lie, I pointed him to the other side of the hill. He walked to the edge of the cliff, leaned over to get a better look at the indicated spot, and turned to me asking if we knew each other. I introduced myself. Yes, we have met. I'm Howard, Dorothy's husband. His eyes widened in surprise, and his last words were, "Holy crap." At that moment, I couldn't help myself and pushed him over the edge. He went down like a stone. The next moments unfolded in slow motion. It seemed like an eternity before he reached the bottom and I heard a thud. But reality showed that only 4 or 5 seconds had passed. I glanced at my cell phone. Jimmy was lying face down, his leg twisted in an unnatural position. I took a call from Stephanie, assuring her I'd be back at work in about 10 minutes. Changing my route, I changed my hiking boots for office Oxfords and tossed the boots into the nearest dumpster. Dorothy was stunned by my early return. Jimmy's body was found the next day. Dorothy was upset to learn that he hadn't shown up for work and everyone was talking about it. Her surprise was evident when I asked about Hawk Mountain, assuming she was unaware of his actions. 2 days later, Detective Louis Lang and a colleague visited me at work. He introduced himself and explained that he was investigating the circumstances surrounding Jimmy's accident. The detective mentioned an alleged affair between Jimmy and my wife, but I denied having any knowledge of their relationship, claiming that there had only been work-related contact between my wife and Jimmy. Detective Lang persisted, saying that my wife admitted to dating Jimmy for over 3 months. He asked about our meeting, but I dismissed his statement, emphasizing that my wife and I should discuss it privately. The detective also mentioned Stephanie's account of my whereabouts that Tuesday, suggesting that I had spent most of the day in the basement. I clarified that I was only there for a couple hours and spent the rest of the time in my office. After checking my alibi, the detective left, apologizing for the inconvenience. Furious, I threw the stapler across the room, feeling the anger literally emanating from me. Stephanie walked in, expressing concern that she might have said something wrong. I calmed her down, assuring her that she hadn't caused me any trouble, and thanked her for her help. I answered her questions as truthfully as I could. The next few days looked like they were going to be very busy, but without much trouble. Stephanie responded understandingly to my words. My intention was not to solve the problems with Dorothy. I was looking for a way to permanently end our marriage. Fortunately, we had no children and we lived in a rented house. I had once dreamed of a family with children, but now I was grateful for the circumstances that allowed me to maintain my privacy. Without waiting for the end of the workday, I packed up and left. Stephanie nodded in understanding as I walked out. We had $95,000 in our family account. I took $72,000 with me and headed to the local GM dealer. 2 hours later, after spending $59,000, I drove away in a yellow Hummer. I didn't need a new house anymore. As I pulled up to the house, I realized I would need extra money for gas. When Dorothy came outside and asked about my extravagant purchase, I showed her the new car, explaining that I needed a sportier car. Dorothy flared up, wondering how we could afford such a purchase. I calmed her down, telling her I paid cash. Her anger intensified when she began to question the source of the money. Upon entering the house, a crowd gathered on the doorstep. Dorothy grabbed my arm, asking why I was introducing myself as a single guy and why I had decided not to buy the house with her. I replied that I bought the Hummer because I saw no point in staying with her. Tensions rose when I mentioned to Dorothy about Detective Lang's visit and my suspicions about her involvement in Jimmy Baxter's death. I accused her of infidelity, claiming that she had been cheating on me for over 3 months with a coworker at work. She denied the allegations, saying she had never cheated on me with anyone. "How can you accuse me of such a thing?" Feeling angry, I clenched my fists. I had compromising photos that could prove Dorothy wrong. However, making them public would expose my presence on Hawk Mountain the day Jimmy died. I continued to accuse her of infidelity. She denied my accusations, but our confrontation almost turned into a fight. Dorothy later claimed I would not get a divorce and offered to let me sleep in her new truck. She kicked me out of the house, but also claimed that we would go to Jimmy's funeral together. My response was curt, "Kiss my ass." Jimmy's funeral was attended by his wife from another neighborhood. Dorothy and I attended. Emotions ran high during the ceremony. Heather, Jimmy's widow, confronted Dorothy, accusing her of destroying her marriage and family. Dorothy was at a loss for words. Tensions remained high as we left the funeral. Outside the car, several onlookers eavesdropped on our heated conversation. My attention focused on Heather Baxter, who watched my wife lead with visible hatred in her eyes. I attempted to defuse the situation by apologizing on my wife's behalf and suggesting that any accusations were unintentional. Heather rejected my attempt, considering me weak for defending a man who had violated a trust. On the drive home, Dorothy remained silent. Upon arriving home, she expressed her disappointment, questioning my decision to go to the funeral, but was finally humiliated and left the house without another word. From that moment on, I decided to sleep in the extra bedroom, finding relief in the lack of expectation of intimacy. The next day, feeling duty-bound, I drove to Heather Baxter's house. She was in the garage with her sons, busy reassembling boxes. Despite my attempts to apologize, she showed no interest in talking. Heather went on about her business, clearly having no time for my concerns. She offered to help me, and I accepted. Heather walked me to the garage and told me to clear out Jimmy's closet and drawers and pack everything into bags for charity. Her sons, Josh and Terry, joined in as well. After completing the task, they shook my hand and I left with bags of clothes. At home, Dorothy was making chili. I suggested that in light of recent events, it might be worth considering divorce. However, Dorothy rejected the idea, denying any connection to Jimmy and expressed her desire to preserve our marriage. She argued that our visions for the future were incompatible and insisted on staying together, seeing no grounds for divorce. The evening passed in silence. Dorothy seemed apathetic. In the bathroom, I started vomiting and noticed blood. I asked Dorothy to drive me to the hospital, but she refused, suggesting I take the car myself and rebuked me for childish behavior. I grabbed my keys and headed for the car. A neighbor who was taking out the trash asked what was wrong, and I asked him to take me to the emergency room. I woke up to sunlight streaming into the room. Detective Lang was sitting by the window reading a magazine. He greeted me and informed me that I was being treated for a severe allergic reaction to chili. The doctor suspected that the food had been intentionally poisoned. They took steps to make me well, including gastric lavage and administering an antidote similar to the antidote for rat poison. They also checked Dorothy, who had eaten the same food, but found no symptoms of poisoning in her. When I was ready, the doctor let me go home and gave me a list of foods I should avoid. At home, Dorothy apologized for her indifferent reaction to my experiences. From that point on, I shut myself in the spare room. The next day, I stopped eating at home. I informed Stephanie of my sick leave and asked her to help me find an apartment. Dorothy was unaware of my plans and was very upset about the failure of the police to solve the poisoning case. I visited my insurance agent and took out $1 million life policy with Dorothy as the beneficiary. I then cashed in the policy and canceled the health insurance. At the bank, I changed the beneficiaries to my mother. Dorothy withdrew $112,000 from our home fund. I explained the situation to the bank and they agreed to close the credit cards and open a new account. Stephanie offered to help, and the bank manager helped keep my finances safe. Dressed for bird watching, Dorothy mentioned that she was going to vacation at Hawk Mountain. I suspiciously decided to follow her. After she left, I noticed her car in the upper parking lot next to a gray Ford Ranger. I quickly circled the mountain and arrived at the lower section. Her mountain bike was chained up. Dorothy was talking to a man holding a small shotgun. They exchanged a photo and an envelope. Dorothy headed toward me, and I ducked behind a ledge. The man was watching the trail from the upper parking lot, assuming I had come from there. Dorothy expected me to follow her downstairs. Her bike disappeared into the upper parking lot. I found the unlocked Ford and confirmed my suspicions. I found a tracksuit in the front seat, pulled a registration card from the glove compartment, a box of matches from the center console, and some athletic pants. I rolled them up tightly and threw them into the gas tank, then lit the end. After the resulting explosion, I hurriedly left the scene. I hoped Dorothy had given him enough money to cover it up. I broke several traffic laws while rushing home on country roads. Parking my bike behind the garage, I grabbed the fertilizer spreader and started rolling it across the lawn. Soon my wife came out of the house with a disappointed expression on her face. Her cell phone rang, and although I couldn't hear the conversation, the caller seemed to be agitated about something. I explained to Dorothy that I had left the Volvo in the mountains and decided to bike home to warm up, and asked her to give me a ride back. She was nervously playing with her fingers during the ride. As we approached Mountain Road, our path was crossed by a convoy of fire trucks climbing to the top. A police officer stopped us, reporting an accident and fire at the top of the mountain where Dorothy's car was parked. Eventually, we were allowed to go to the top with a police escort. Dorothy got out of the Hummer, thanked me, and told me to go home. When she was out of sight, I followed her, taking advantage of the commotion. She was calming down a man on the trail. After a 10-minute argument, they approached the fire chief. Eventually, Dorothy and the man got into the Volvo and hurried back to the Hummer. I left before they could deal with the fire trucks and hoses. As I drove out, I saw the Volvo turning the corner of the house. I immediately drove off to meet Heather. After apologizing for being late, I shared a more muted version of events with her. We spent time with Josh and Terry, ordering pizza for dinner. Later, I returned home and Dorothy arrived late. I refrained from asking where she had been. The next morning, while Dorothy was showering, I removed the SIM card from her cell phone. Then I visited the cell phone office, deactivated her service, and paid $200 to cancel her landline DSL and cable TV, which were to be disconnected by the end of the day. I notified the landlord of my move, suggesting that he contact Dorothy to set up a new lease. By the end of the week, the water and electricity to the house would be turned off. I quickly loaded my things into the Hummer and headed to the apartment Stephanie had found. She left me a note telling me that Detective Lang had asked her to call him at the station. When I confronted Lang, he grinned and remarked that I was still alive. He mentioned a man named Bobby Terrell and showed me the Ford's license plate number. I denied knowing Bobby. Lang reported that my wife and Bobby had been in frequent contact and had withdrawn substantial sums of money. Upon learning of a vital insurance policy that I had canceled, Lang cautioned me that Bobby might pose a threat despite the loss of his truck. He expressed admiration for the way I handled the situation. Lang investigated the reason my wife wanted me dead, especially since I had canceled the insurance without her knowledge. He warned that if anything happened in the near future, I should let him know immediately. It was recommended that I take a vacation, but I doubted that would stop my wife. After meeting with Lang, I left home and he emphasized the need for caution. I immediately headed over to Heather's house. We went to lunch together and enjoyed sushi while discussing the situation cryptically. I was careful not to divulge too many details. Heather laughed about the incident. The next day, I felt cozy and comfortable in her company. After a pleasant evening with friends, I decided to go back to work. Heather and I had ambitious plans for the weekend. Surprisingly, on the drive to work, I realized that I wasn't feeling homesick for Dorothy. I drove with a smile. Everything seemed to be going great. However, coming down the hill, I discovered a problem with the brakes. They were unresponsive. Despite trying to shift gears and slow down, the Hummer kept picking up speed. Traffic and intersections appeared in front of me. I swerved, and the car spun and flipped. The world went dark, and when I came to, I was in a hospital room. I felt pain and heard moaning. The nurse and doctor looked into my eyes. Heather's presence calmed me, even though I was in pain. The medical team assessed my injuries, and I went back to sleep. When I awoke, Heather was asleep in the chair, and I felt my condition improving. Lewis came to see me daily. I learned that I had suffered a concussion, a broken collarbone, arm, and several ribs. The doctors were concerned about my unconsciousness, which lasted 2 days. When I regained consciousness, they gave me some soup. Lewis apologized for not noticing that the brake pipes on the Humvee had been cut. They suspected foul play and questioned Dorothy's whereabouts at the time. Heather visited me daily. Dorothy signed some forms and disappeared despite the pain. As soon as I began to feel better, I was ready to leave the hospital. Heather, who was taking care of me, said the doctor suggested I go see her. We spent time together and Heather took care of my recovery. Stephanie also visited me. After that, I decided to go back to work. Back at the old house, we discussed moving our belongings out with the owner. Stephanie continued to visit me while I made plans to return to work. Meanwhile, my relationship with Heather went from platonic to romantic. I moved into her bedroom and our bond strengthened. We went to social events and parent-teacher conferences together. 3 months later, I decided to propose to Heather over dinner, expressing my desire to spend the rest of my life with her. She said yes, but we faced a small problem. Her family was in Philadelphia. This story asks questions about the moral choices of the characters, including the main character who decided to get rid of his wife's lover. Was his wife aware of his involvement? And why did she want to get rid of him? Opinions may differ, but many may believe that the protagonist committed a terrible act that is wrong under any circumstances. The unjustifiability of his actions is emphasized by the fact that in the end he went unpunished, which causes outrage. The story also leaves the question of the widow, who, shortly after her husband's death, married the man involved in his death. This story leaves room for reflection on the morality and consequences of our actions, and perhaps makes us question the validity of our own conclusions.
Thank you so much for watching my video and your time. Please subscribe to my channel and click on the bell button. Also, I am very interested to know your personal opinion about this story. You can write it in the comments. I will definitely answer you personally.